The man in seat 1A, the early morning sun painted the airport in soft gold. But inside the terminal, everything was noise, movement, and impatience. People rushed to gates with half-zipped bags, phones pressed against their ears, coffee spilling on tiled floors. Among them walked a thin, quiet man in a simple blue jacket and worn leather shoes. He had no bodyguards, no entourage, and his ticket was folded carefully in his hand. No one noticed him. No one paused to look twice. To most people, he was just another passenger. But this man was Sundar Pichai. The gate for Flight 247 to San Francisco was unusually crowded. First-class passengers were called first, and the crew stood straight, ready to greet each person with rehearsed warmth. Standing at the entrance was Maya, a flight attendant with sharp eyes and a polite smile that she could switch on like a light. She had worked in the skies for 7 years and believed she could read anyone at a glance. Today, she would be tested in ways she never imagined. When the man in the blue jacket approached the first-class boarding line, Maya's smile flickered for just a moment. She noticed the simple clothes, the worn shoes, the lack of expensive accessories. He carried no designer luggage, only a modest backpack. She quickly leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "He must be lost. Maybe he thinks this is economy." Her colleague shrugged. As Sundar handed her his ticket, Maya's eyes narrowed. "Seat 1A, first class." She forced a smile. "Sir, are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her tone calm but slightly patronizing. He nodded gently. "Yes, that's correct," he replied in a soft voice. There was no arrogance, no defensiveness, only quiet certainty. "May I see your ID?" she asked. She was not required to check it at this point, but something in her instinct told her this man didn't belong here. Perhaps she had seen too many people try to sneak into first class. Perhaps she had been burned before. Sundar calmly handed her his ID. Her eyes scanned the name. She didn't recognize it. She had never heard the name Sundar Pichai before. In her mind, real VIP names were actors, politicians, athletes. Not someone like this. "Thank you, sir." "Please wait a moment," she said, stepping aside to call her supervisor. Nearby passengers glanced at Sundar with curiosity, some with irritation. The man behind him, wearing a tailored suit and gold watch, rolled his eyes. "Some people don't know where they belong," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. Sundar heard it too, but he stayed silent, his face calm, his posture relaxed. Maya returned a few minutes later, still unsure. The supervisor had confirmed the ticket was genuine. Reluctantly, she let him board. But inside her mind, the judgment remained. She decided to keep an eye on him during the flight. As Sundar walked into first class, whispers followed him. A young woman seated in 1B glanced at him, then at his shoes, and then at her friend across the aisle. They exchanged knowing looks as if to say, "How did he get here?" The suited man from earlier shook his head and muttered something again. Sundar quietly placed his backpack in the overhead bin and sat down. He didn't recline his seat immediately like the others. He simply looked out the window, his face thoughtful. The flight took off smoothly. The seatbelt sign turned off, and Maya began the usual service routine. She moved through first class with practiced elegance, offering champagne and hot towels. When she reached Sundar's seat, she hesitated. He had declined the champagne earlier, asking only for a glass of water. Now he smiled politely and said, "Thank you," when she handed him a towel. "Business or vacation?" Maya asked, trying to make small talk, but also deep down still testing him. "Just a work trip," he replied. "What kind of work?" she asked, tilting her head. "Technology," he said simply. She expected more. Most first-class passengers love talking about their jobs. They like to mention big names, big deals, important titles. But this man didn't elaborate. It frustrated her slightly. She thought he was being vague because he had nothing real to say. "Must be nice to afford first class for a work trip," she said, half joking, half probing. He smiled again. "I'm grateful for it," he said. She moved on unconvinced. But a few rows back, the suited man had been listening. He leaned forward, resting his elbow on the armrest, and spoke loud enough for others to hear. "Technology, huh? Let me guess, some crypto startup?" He laughed to himself. His voice carried a mix of arrogance and insecurity. Sundar didn't respond. An hour into the flight, Maya noticed something strange. A group of passengers in economy had started whispering excitedly. Some were pointing toward the first-class section, their phones out. She thought maybe a celebrity had boarded at the last minute. She discreetly walked back to check. To her surprise, a young man in economy was showing his phone to others. "Look, it's really him," he whispered. "Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google. He's sitting right there in 1A. Maya froze for a second. The name echoed in her head. Sundar Pichai. She had heard it somewhere. Maybe in a news headline, maybe on TV. But she had never seen his face clearly before. Now she turned slowly toward 1A, where the quiet man in the blue jacket sat reading something on his tablet. Her stomach tightened. A mix of surprise, embarrassment, and regret flooded her. She hurried back to the galley and pulled out her phone, pretending to check the passenger manifest. There it was. His name printed clearly, along with a note from corporate VIP passenger. CSO of Google. Handle with utmost care. Her breath caught. She remembered how she had questioned his seat, how she had doubted him, how she had whispered to her colleague. Shame burned her cheeks. But the flight was far from over and something unexpected was about to unfold. 2 hours later, turbulence hit. It started lightly, then grew stronger. The plane shook, trays rattled, cups spilled. Passengers gasped. Maya's training kicked in. She moved quickly to secure items and reassure people. But one passenger in first class panicked badly. The young woman in 1B clutched her armrests, tears welling in her eyes. I can't do this, I can't, she whispered rapidly. Maya rushed to her side, speaking calmly, but the woman's breathing was fast, uncontrolled. Suddenly, a quiet voice joined in. Breathe slowly, Sundar said gently. He turned toward the woman, meeting her eyes with calm steadiness. Inhale with me. 1, 2, 3. Exhale. 1, 2, 3. Maya watched in silence. The woman followed his rhythm. Her breathing began to slow. The panic in her eyes softened. The turbulence continued, but the cabin felt calmer somehow. Sundar's voice was steady, grounded, reassuring. Even Maya felt strangely comforted by it. After several minutes, the turbulence passed. Passengers sighed with relief. Maya thanked Sundar softly, her voice a little shaky. Thank you, she said. He smiled. We're all in this together, he replied. She walked back to the galley, her mind racing. Here was a man who could have responded with arrogance when she doubted him. He could have snapped at the suited man who mocked him. He could have ignored the frightened woman beside him. But he did none of those things. He responded with calm humility and kindness. And she who had judged him so quickly now felt something she rarely felt on flights. Respect. But just as she began to relax, something else happened. Near the middle of the flight, the plane's communication system experienced a sudden glitch. The captain's voice came over the intercom, slightly distorted. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a temporary issue with our navigation system. Please remain calm. We are working to resolve it. Murmurs filled the cabin. Maya felt her pulse quicken. She knew these situations were usually resolved quickly, but there was always a shadow of fear. She moved through the aisles, checking on passengers. When she reached Sundar's seat again, he looked up and asked quietly, May I speak to the captain for a moment? She hesitated. Sir, we usually don't. I have some experience with systems, he said gently. I might be able to offer some help. She didn't know whether to laugh or to believe him, but then she remembered who he was. Sundar Pichai, CSO of Google, a man who understood technology better than almost anyone. She nodded slowly. Wait here. I'll ask. She hurried to the cockpit door, her heart pounding. Never in her career had a passenger offered to help the captain. This was uncharted territory. But the captain recognized the name instantly. After a brief discussion, he agreed to meet Sundar in the jump seat area. As Sundar stepped toward the cockpit, the suited man sneered again. What's he gonna do? Reboot the plane like a laptop? He whispered to another passenger. They laughed, but their laughter carried nervousness now. Inside the small space near the cockpit, Sundar listened carefully as the captain explained the glitch. The backup system was online, but the primary navigation display was frozen. Sundar asked a few technical questions. His calmness impressed the crew. He wasn't trying to take over. He was simply thinking. Then, something unexpected happened. Sundar made a suggestion based on his deep knowledge of software systems. It wasn't about flying the plane, but about resetting a part of the communication module in a specific sequence that the captain hadn't tried yet. After a quick exchange with ground control, the captain followed the steps. Within minutes, the primary navigation display came back online. Relief flooded the cockpit. The captain shook Sundar's hand, amazed. You just saved us a lot of trouble, he said. Maya stood nearby, speechless. The quiet man in the blue jacket had just helped fix a plane mid-flight. As Sundar returned to his seat, passengers noticed the captain himself walking through the cabin to quietly thank him. Whispers spread again, louder now. The suited man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. his earlier arrogance fading. The young woman in 1B looked at Sundar with awe. Maya felt a lump in her throat. When the plane finally reached cruising stability, Maya brought Sundar a special dessert from business class. "Thank you, truly," she said, her voice sincere. He smiled. "You're doing a great job," he replied. The kindness in his words caught her off guard. After all the ways she had judged him, he was now encouraging her. As the sun began to set outside, painting the clouds in orange and pink, Maya leaned against the galley wall, lost in thought. She remembered her first impression of him. She remembered her doubts. She realized how wrong she had been, but little did she know. The real test of humility and kindness was still ahead. The flight had several hours to go, and something would happen that would change the night completely. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was different, slower, heavier. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation." Maya's heart stopped for a second. Passengers looked up from their screens. Sundar turned his head toward the cockpit door, his eyes sharp, alert. Everyone waited for the next words. And then they came. The unexpected storm. The captain's voice lingered in the air like a shadow, heavy and uncertain. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, the hum of the engine suddenly feeling louder than usual. Maya froze for a heartbeat near the galley, her hands resting on the counter as if steadying herself against invisible waves. Sundar sat quietly in 1A, his posture still calm but his eyes sharp, observing everything. He had the look of someone who understood that silence before a storm was sometimes the most dangerous moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain continued, his tone steady but serious. "We've been informed of severe weather conditions developing unexpectedly along our flight path. A strong storm system has formed ahead of us, and air traffic control is currently working with us to find an alternate route. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The cabin filled with whispers. Some passengers stared at the seatback screens, watching the small airplane icon creep across the digital map, now heading toward a dark cluster of swirling clouds. Others clutched their armrests. Maya took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and walked slowly through the aisle, giving calm smiles that hid the tightening in her chest. She had been through rough weather before, but something in the captain's voice told her this was different. This was not routine turbulence. This was unpredictable. As the plane adjusted course, the first tremors began. The cabin lights flickered faintly, and the overhead compartments gave a soft creak. Sundar watched the storm map on his screen. His face was unreadable, but his mind was working quickly, connecting information, imagining possibilities. Maya noticed him glance at the map, then toward the cockpit door as if calculating the unseen layers behind the situation. 15 minutes later, the storm arrived like a sudden roar. The plane jolted violently, sending gasps through the cabin. A cup of tea slipped from someone's hand and splashed across the aisle. Maya rushed to secure loose items, her body swaying with each shudder of the aircraft. The wind outside howled against the fuselage, and lightning flashed far away through the small windows, illuminating faces filled with fear for a split second at a time. The suited man who had mocked Sundar earlier gripped his seat tightly now, his confident expression replaced by quiet panic. His eyes darted around as if searching for control in a situation where there was none. The turbulence grew stronger. Trays rattled. Overhead bins shook. A few passengers began to cry softly, their fear contagious. Maya's heart raced, but she kept her voice even as she walked down the aisle, checking belts, offering reassurance. Inside, though, she felt a storm of her own. She remembered the captain's words. The storm was unexpected. Storms like this were dangerous because they forced pilots to rely on instinct and quick decision-making, and any mistake could spiral fast. Amid the chaos, Sundar did something unexpected. He calmly reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notebook and pen. He began sketching something, lines and curves forming quickly as he glanced between his screen and the paper. Maya noticed him and hesitated. "Sir," she whispered as she leaned close, "please keep your seatbelt fastened and stay still." He nodded but continued writing. "I'm just noting something down," he said softly. His voice carried no fear. It was like he was in a quiet office thinking through a puzzle. Maya didn't fully understand why, but his calmness had a strange effect on her. It steadied her heartbeat even as the plane shook again. Outside, the storm grew darker. The plane entered a thick cloud bank, and visibility disappeared. Rain pelted against the windows like thrown gravel. Lightning flashed closer now, followed by deep rumbles that passengers felt in their chests. Maya saw the young woman in 1B close her eyes tightly, whispering something like a prayer. The suited man's hands trembled as he checked his watch again and again, as if time could rescue him. Suddenly, the seatbelt sign dinged again, and the captain's voice came on, louder this time. "All flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." The message was short and strict. Maya felt a chill. Such announcements meant the cockpit expected serious turbulence ahead. She quickly secured the last tray and slid into her jump seat near the front, across from Sundar. Their eyes met briefly. She saw no fear in his, only quiet determination. Then it happened. A violent drop. The plane suddenly lost altitude for a split second, sending a wave of weightlessness through the cabin. People screamed. Drinks and bags flew upward, then crashed back down. Someone in the back cried out. Maya clenched the straps of her harness, her stomach twisting. Sundar held onto the armrests firmly, his face calm but focused. The drop ended as quickly as it began, but it left behind a silence filled with rapid breathing and racing hearts. In that moment, Maya understood how fragile the line between calm and panic could be. She scanned the faces around her. Some were crying. Some were frozen. Some clung to strangers' hands without hesitation. The captain's voice returned, strained but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are navigating through a severe thunderstorm cell. Our instruments are stable and we are in full control. We appreciate your patience." Maya listened carefully. His words were reassuring, but she caught something in his tone. A small crack. Something he didn't say openly. She had worked enough flights to sense when a captain was under immense pressure. This storm was pushing them hard. As the turbulence continued, Sundar leaned forward slightly and called out to Maya over the sound of the engines. "Can I ask something?" he said. She nodded. "Does the crew have a real-time weather overlay in the cockpit?" he asked. She blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, but I don't know the details." He nodded slowly, his pen moving again on the paper. Then he said something that made her heartbeat quicken. "The way this storm developed, it doesn't match normal patterns. It's moving faster than usual." Maya stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "It feels like the system they're tracking has shifted mid-flight," he explained. "It's like following a road on a map and suddenly the road itself starts to move." She didn't fully understand, but the seriousness in his voice unsettled her. Before she could respond, the captain called for her over the interphone. She unbuckled quickly and answered. His voice was low. "Maya, can you ask Mr. Pichai if he can step forward for a moment? We could use his perspective on something." She froze. "You mean in the cockpit? During the storm?" "Yes. Quickly, please." She turned toward Sundar, who had already fastened his seatbelt tighter, ready. She gestured for him to follow her. The passengers watched curiously as he stood, steady even as the plane trembled. The suited man frowned, clearly unsure why this quiet man was being summoned again. The young woman in 1B looked up with a flicker of trust in her eyes. Inside the cockpit, the air was different, focused, tense. The windshield showed only dark clouds and flashes of light. The captain and first officer worked in near-silent coordination, adjusting settings and monitoring readings. They welcomed Sundar quickly, explaining that their weather radar was giving conflicting data. Two storm cells seemed to be merging ahead, something rare and unpredictable. Sundar listened intently, absorbing every detail. He pointed to a section of their display and asked a few rapid questions about signal refresh intervals and data latency. The pilots exchanged glances, surprised at his understanding. He then offered a simple but clever suggestion: to temporarily reroute the radar signal through an alternate frequency check, to get a cleaner return. It wasn't something they'd typically do mid-storm, but his explanation made sense. After a quick decision, they tried it. Within moments, the radar image clarified. The merged storm cell's movement became visible in real time. The pilots adjusted their flight path, carving a narrow but safe arc around the worst part of the storm. Turbulence remained, but the worst danger was avoided. A wave of relief washed through the cockpit like fresh air. Maya stood at the doorway, stunned. She had just watched a man in a simple blue jacket give critical input during one of the most stressful flight situations imaginable. He didn't touch controls, didn't overstep, didn't act like a hero. He simply used his knowledge with humility and precision. As Sundar returned to his seat, passengers noticed the change. The turbulence softened gradually. The lights stabilized. People exhaled together like a shared heartbeat, calming down. Some even clapped softly, unsure exactly what had happened but sensing something significant had taken place. Maya returned to her jump seat and looked at Sundar again. Something inside her shifted quietly. Admiration, yes, but also something deeper. It was a kind of respect that wasn't forced by titles or wealth. It came from witnessing real leadership. Quiet, steady, humble. But just as calm returned to the cabin, a new sound cut through the air. A sharp, irregular beeping from the panel above the jump seat. Maya's eyes snapped upward. It wasn't a normal alert. It was an oxygen system warning. Her breath caught. She stood slowly, listening. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time without his usual composed rhythm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with an unexpected technical issue. Please remain seated." The storm outside was fading, but something inside the plane had just begun. The silent signal, the beeping continued steadily above the jump seat, like a heartbeat that had suddenly lost its rhythm. Maya stared at the panel, her training whispering possibilities in her mind. Oxygen system warning. It could be a sensor malfunction, or it could be something far more serious. The storm outside had eased, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tension spread slowly, like water seeping under a closed door. Passengers didn't yet know what the sound meant, but they felt its presence. It was sharp, unfamiliar, and unsettling. Maya pressed the interphone, calling the cockpit. The captain answered quickly. His voice was lower than before, calm but stripped of the usual polished tone. "We're getting mixed readings from the forward oxygen supply system," he said. "The backup is stable for now, but we need you to monitor the cabin closely. If there's any sign of pressure change, you'll know what to do." She swallowed hard. "Copy that," she replied. As she hung up, Sundar looked up from his seat in 1A. His eyes followed the sound, then met hers. There was no panic in his face, only quiet alertness, like someone reading a complex problem. She hesitated for a moment, then approached him. "Everything is fine," she said softly, the kind of line flight attendants were trained to deliver. But in her heart, she knew the situation was delicate. He nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. Then after a brief pause, he added, "Is it the oxygen system?" She blinked. "How did you—" "The sound," he said simply. "It's not a general alert. It's a localized system warning. I've read about aircraft designs before." She stared at him for a second, amazed at how calmly he spoke about something that would terrify most passengers. Part of her wanted to keep everything professional, distant. But another part of her, the human part, wanted to be honest with someone who clearly understood more than she could explain in a few words. "There's a reading issue," she whispered. "They're checking it." He nodded again, his eyes drifting briefly toward the overhead vents, as if imagining the invisible systems that ran above their heads like veins. The plane cruised smoothly now, but the earlier storm had left everyone slightly raw, their nerves thin. The suited man across the aisle noticed Maya's quick conversation with Sundar. His suspicion returned. "What's going on?" he demanded in a low but tense voice. "Is something wrong with the plane?" Maya forced a calm smile. "Everything is under control, sir. Please stay seated," but his eyes narrowed. Fear disguised itself as anger. "First the storm, now this sound. I have a right to know," he muttered. A few passengers nearby turned their heads, sensing the shift. Fear had a way of spreading without permission. Maya returned to the galley, keeping her movements smooth. Behind her professional exterior, thoughts collided. Oxygen system warnings were rare. Most were false alarms. But if the system truly had a fault, time mattered. At high altitude, a sudden loss of pressure left only seconds to act. Minutes passed slowly, stretching like thin wire. The beeping stopped briefly, then started again. This time, a few passengers noticed. Whispers rose like soft wind through leaves. Maya could see it in their faces. The quiet scanning of each other, the subtle tightening of jaws, the exchanged glances that carried unspoken questions. The captain called again. His voice was steady but clipped. "Maya, we're seeing a drop in the forward oxygen reserve reading. We're switching to backup flow, but I need you to prepare the crew discreetly. Don't alarm the passengers yet." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. She turned to her fellow attendants and gave a series of silent signals. Subtle, practiced gestures that only trained crew would understand. Seat checks. Mask readiness. Communication lines clear. In seconds, they shifted into quiet emergency posture without a single public announcement. Their professionalism masked the gravity of the situation. As Maya moved through the aisle, she felt Sundar's gaze follow her briefly. Not in fear, but in understanding. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention. He simply watched, ready. Suddenly, the plane gave a slight shudder. Not from turbulence, but from an internal system adjustment. A soft hiss filled the air for a brief moment as the oxygen system switched modes. Passengers looked around nervously. The suited man stood halfway, gripping his armrest. What was that? He snapped. Why did it hiss? Maya stepped toward him quickly. Sir, please sit down, she said firmly. It's just a system adjustment. Everything is fine. But his voice rose slightly, sharp with anxiety. Don't lie to me. I know when something's wrong. His tone drew more attention now. People nearby leaned in. Fear spread faster than any announcement. Then unexpectedly, Sundar spoke up. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried clearly through the quiet cabin. It's a routine system check, he said calmly, looking directly at the suited man. Planes make these adjustments all the time. Panicking won't help anyone. The man hesitated. Sundar's tone wasn't confrontational. It was steady, precise, almost like an anchor in the middle of confusion. Others looked at him, recognizing him now. Whispers began again, not fearful this time, but curious. Isn't that the Google CO? Someone whispered near row 2. He helped the captain earlier, another replied. The suited man slowly sat back down, his bravado fading. Sundar turned his gaze back to the window as if nothing happened. Maya watched this quietly. She realized that his presence alone was calming people in a way no scripted safety line could. 10 minutes later, the captain's voice returned, slower than before. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we're currently assessing a minor technical issue with one of our onboard systems. The aircraft remains fully under control, and there's no immediate danger. However, as a precaution, we will be making an unscheduled diversion to Denver. We appreciate your cooperation. The word diversion hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Passengers exchanged worried looks. Unscheduled diversions were rare and rarely simple. Maya moved down the aisles, reassuring people with soft tones. Sundar closed his notebook slowly, sliding it back into his backpack. He knew this wasn't just a routine stop. Oxygen systems were critical. If they were diverting, something serious was developing. As the plane began to adjust its course, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Maya looked out through a small window near the galley. The sky ahead was clear, a strange contrast to the tension inside. She thought about the hours before, when she had doubted Sundar's place in first class. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now he was quietly becoming a stabilizing force, not because of his title, but because of the way he carried himself when things fell apart. Suddenly, the oxygen warning beep changed tone, shorter, sharper, insistent. Maya froze. This wasn't a sensor glitch anymore. This was the system signaling a real issue. At that exact moment, the captain's voice came over the crew line. Maya, initiate oxygen mask readiness. We have a slow pressure loss in the forward cabin. Not explosive, but steady. We're descending to a safer altitude. Keep the passengers calm. Her breath hitched. Slow decompression was quieter than the dramatic scenes people imagined. But it was just as dangerous. She and the crew moved with silent precision, checking rows, readying masks, maintaining order. The passengers noticed the change in their movements, sensing seriousness in the air. Maya passed by 1A again. Sundar looked up at her, and for a moment something wordless passed between them. She saw no fear in his eyes, only readiness. She thought of all the loud, powerful people she had served in first class over the years, celebrities, executives, politicians, and how most of them lost their composure when control slipped from their hands. Sundar was different. His quiet confidence didn't demand attention. It created it. As the plane began its gradual emergency descent, a soft rush of air filled the cabin. The masks hadn't dropped yet, but the crew was seconds away from triggering them manually if needed. Passengers clutched their armrests as the plane angled downward. Outside, the dark sky was giving way to a pale horizon. Then, in the middle of that quiet descent, a child's voice broke the silence. "Mommy, why is the plane going down?" a little boy asked loudly from row 5. His mother tried to shush him, but the question echoed through the tense cabin like a spark. And just like that, murmurs turned into a wave of questions. Are we safe? What's happening? Is it the storm again? Maya and the crew moved quickly to reassure them, but the tension was rising. Through it all, Sundar remained composed. He leaned slightly toward the boy and said gently, "The pilots are just taking us to a safer height. Everything's okay." His tone carried such simple certainty that even adults nearby exhaled. Maya returned to her jump seat as the captain announced their descent to 10,000 feet. The oxygen warning tone softened. The pressure stabilized slightly. They were not out of danger yet, but the immediate threat was easing. She looked at Sundar again, seated calmly by the window. The man she had misjudged at the start of the flight had now quietly played a role in steadying both the cockpit and the cabin twice. But she didn't know that the most unexpected part of this journey was still ahead. The diversion to Denver would not go as planned. Something on the ground was waiting for them. Something that would test not just systems and nerves, but human hearts. The runway lights, the descent continued steadily, the engines humming at a lower pitch as the aircraft dropped to 10,000 feet. The sudden height change had softened the oxygen warning, but the cabin still held a quiet tension, like a theater moments before the curtain rises. Passengers clutched blankets, phones, each other's hands. Outside, the thick clouds gave way to clearer skies, and through the small windows, distant lights began to flicker on the ground below. The edge of Denver, glowing faintly in the darkness like scattered embers. Maya moved through the aisle slowly, checking faces, checking belts. The emergency descent had unsettled everyone, but she could feel something else in the air now, something more fragile than fear. It was the moment after panic, when people began to realize how close things could have gone wrong. Some whispered softly to each other, sharing fragments of personal stories. Some sat in silence, eyes fixed on nothing. Sundar sat in 1A, looking out the window with a thoughtful expression, his hands folded loosely in his lap. His calmness had become almost like part of the cabin itself. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently on course for an emergency diversion to Denver International Airport. We'll be on the ground shortly. Please remain seated with your belts fastened and follow crew instructions upon landing." The word emergency hung in the air. It was said softly, but it carried weight. Maya felt it sink into the cabin like invisible dust, settling over every passenger. She returned to her jump seat at the front, her eyes scanning the aisles. She noticed the suited man sitting stiffly, his hands pressed together. Earlier he had been loud, certain, almost mocking. Now he looked like someone trying to hold together a fragile version of control. Beside him, the young woman from 1B sat quietly, her eyes still red from the earlier panic but her breathing steady. As the plane approached Denver, Sundar leaned slightly toward the window. The city lights grew clearer, stretched across the darkness like a net. Maya caught the small movement and felt an odd sense of relief. Something about watching him look at the lights gave her the strange feeling that things might steady themselves again. But that sense didn't last long. The cockpit called her over the crew line. The captain's voice was quiet but tense. "Maya, ground control just informed us that the airport has gone into temporary emergency mode. A separate aircraft made an emergency landing shortly before us, and one of the runways is currently blocked. They're clearing it, but we may need to hold longer than planned." Her stomach tightened. "How long?" she asked. "They don't know yet," he said. 15 minutes. Maybe more. 15 minutes in the air at lower altitude with a compromised oxygen system wasn't ideal. The plane could handle it, but the longer they stayed airborne, the thinner the patients in the cabin would become. She glanced toward the passengers. They didn't know yet. The descent had given them hope of a quick landing. Now that hope had to be stretched. The captain made a short announcement to explain the delay in neutral language. "We'll be entering a holding pattern for a short time before landing. Thank you for your patience." The words were calm, but the passengers were exhausted. Whispers rose again. Some groaned softly. Someone muttered, "Why now?" under their breath. Maya felt the pressure rise, not from altitude, but from human hearts beating a little too fast. She walked down the aisle again, offering warm smiles that felt heavier than usual. She stopped briefly by Sundar's seat. He looked up at her and spoke quietly. "The longer we hold, the more the cabin will tighten," he said. His voice was soft but clear. She nodded slowly. "I know," she replied. It wasn't the kind of exchange between passenger and crew. It was the kind of quiet conversation between two people who both understood something larger than the words themselves. 10 minutes passed. The plane circled above Denver, the city lights spinning slowly beneath them. The oxygen warning remained steady but not critical. Maya noticed some passengers beginning to fray at the edges. A young mother in row 7 rocked her baby gently, whispering lullabies that were more for herself than the child. 2 older men argued softly about whether the plane was running out of air. Fear was trying to find a crack to grow through again. Then, something unexpected happened. A faint burning smell drifted through the cabin. It was subtle, almost like heated plastic. Maya's senses sharpened instantly. She looked toward the galley and saw her colleague already checking equipment. Nothing was out of place. The smell was light but undeniable. Passengers began sniffing the air too, their expressions tightening. She called the cockpit immediately. "We're getting a faint smell in the forward cabin," she reported. "We smell it too," the captain replied. "It's coming from the vent system. It's likely from the oxygen unit heating during backup mode. No smoke, no visible fault, but stay alert." Maya hung up, her heartbeat steady but strong. She knew smells could trigger panic even faster than sounds. Already someone asked loudly, "What is that?" Heads turned. The suited man's eyes widened again. "Is something burning?" he said sharply. Before Maya could respond, Sundar spoke calmly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding rows. "It's probably just the air system warming. Planes do that sometimes when switching backups. It's not fire." His tone was not only calm, it was deliberate. He gave people something to hold on to before fear could take over. Maya caught his eyes for a brief second and gave the slightest nod. His presence had become an unofficial part of the crew's calm strategy, without either of them saying it out loud. Finally, after what felt like much longer than it was, the captain announced their final approach. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to land. Please remain seated. We'll be touching down shortly." The cabin fell into a tense stillness. Outside, the runway lights appeared in a straight glowing line, cutting through the darkness. Maya felt the wheels lower beneath them with a distant thud. Her hands gripped the harness across her chest. Every landing was routine until it wasn't. And tonight, nothing about this flight had been routine. The plane descended smoothly toward the runway, the city lights growing brighter and the ground rushing up fast. Passengers leaned forward unconsciously, as if their collective will could guide the aircraft down. Maya glanced once more at Sundar. He wasn't leaning forward. He was sitting straight, breathing evenly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. It was strange how his stillness felt like gravity. The wheels touched the ground with a loud, clean impact. A ripple of relieved gasps filled the cabin. Some people clapped softly. Others simply closed their eyes. The engines roared in reverse thrust as the plane slowed down. For a moment it felt like everything might finally ease. But then, just as they approached the end of the runway, the plane slowed more abruptly than usual. Maya felt the brakes tighten. The captain's voice came through, quick and clear. "Cabin crew, stand by." Through the small front window she saw flashing lights ahead. Fire trucks, airport vehicles, emergency personnel. Something was waiting for them. It wasn't just their diversion. Denver's runway emergency hadn't fully cleared, and now their flight was part of a larger unfolding situation on the ground. The plane came to a stop on the runway, far from the terminal. The engines hummed low. Outside, red and blue lights flickered against the wet asphalt. Passengers shifted uneasily again. Maya pressed the crew line. "Cockpit?" she asked. The captain answered. "Ground crew is assessing. There's another aircraft still being towed. They want us to hold position. Emergency vehicles are approaching us to check the oxygen system before taxiing." She looked toward the cabin, holding again, but this time on the ground, surrounded by flashing lights. The illusion of safety that usually came with landing had cracked slightly. The suited man muttered, "Why aren't we at the gate?" A woman asked quietly, "Are we in danger?" Whispers grew. Maya steadied her breath and prepared to speak to everyone when a soft voice came from 1A. "Everyone's safe," Sundar said gently, loud enough for the nearby rows. "We're on the ground. This is just protocol." Something about the way he said it made people lean back slightly as if exhaling together. Maya watched him, realizing how unusual it was for a passenger to carry so much silent weight during a flight, not through force but through presence. Outside, emergency crews moved around the plane like shadows under flashing lights. Maya thought the worst was behind them. But she didn't know that what awaited inside the airport, once the doors opened, would be a challenge that no manual had prepared her for. Something unexpected was about to happen that would bring human choices, not technical failures, to the center of everything. The waiting gate, the engine settled into a low hum, the kind of sound that usually meant everything was over, the kind that signaled the end of a long journey, but inside the cabin no one relaxed fully. Outside, the flashing lights painted streaks of red and blue across the windows, reflections that made the cabin feel like it was caught between motion and stillness. Emergency crews moved like silhouettes against the wet runway, their movements purposeful but unhurried, as if they were working through a familiar script that the passengers couldn't read. Maya stood by the galley, watching them through the small front window, her hands folded tightly behind her back. She had done hundreds of flights, seen many unexpected situations, but tonight felt different. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't peace either. It was something in between. a quiet edge where every sound felt amplified. The captain's voice came over the crew line. "Maya, ground team will board to check the oxygen panel before we taxi. Tell the passengers to remain seated. It'll take a few minutes." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her, then turned toward the cabin. The passengers were watching her closely, their eyes following every small movement like the way children look at adults to measure how serious a situation really is. She took a deep breath, walked forward, and spoke clearly but softly. "Ladies and gentlemen, emergency crew will be stepping on board for a brief inspection before we continue to the gate. This is just a precaution. Please remain seated." Her voice worked like a thin thread holding everything together. People stayed calm mostly. Some whispered. Some stared at their phones even though there was no signal. Some simply waited with tired eyes. The suited man shifted restlessly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. Across from him, the young woman in 1B closed her eyes and leaned back, as if finally surrendering to the night. And in 1A, Sundar sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, looking forward. He had said very little since landing, but his presence still anchored the space around him. When the emergency crew entered, wearing reflective jackets and carrying portable equipment, the atmosphere shifted again. Not panic, but a deep collective stillness. They moved efficiently, checking vents, control panels, pressure gauges. Maya stood nearby, translating their quiet technical exchanges into calm silence for the passengers. Sundar observed them with a thoughtful gaze, not intervening, just watching carefully, as if tracing invisible connections between their actions and the night that had unfolded. After 15 long minutes, the lead technician spoke to Maya. His face was calm but focused. The backup oxygen system worked fine. The reading issue came from a faulty sensor. No structural damage. The plane's safe to taxi. Relief washed through her slowly like warm air filling a cold room. She nodded and thanked them. The captain soon announced that they'd be taxiing to a special gate for disembarkation. But when the plane finally began moving again, something unexpected happened. The suited man stood up abruptly, his voice sharp and strained. "I need to get off first," he said. "I have an important meeting tomorrow. I can't be delayed any further." Maya turned toward him quickly. "Sir, please remain seated until we reach the gate," she said firmly. He shook his head, his frustration spilling out. "No, you don't understand. I can't wait. I have connections. I can call someone. I shouldn't have to sit here like everyone else." His voice carried through the cabin. A few passengers turned to look. Some frowned. Some looked down. The young mother in row 7 hugged her baby closer. Uncomfortable with the sudden spike in tension, Maya walked closer to him, lowering her voice. "Sir, for safety reasons, no one can leave their seat until the aircraft is fully parked. I need your cooperation." But he wouldn't sit. His fear had turned into arrogance again, like a shield. "This whole flight has been a disaster," he snapped. "First the storm, then the oxygen, now this. You people don't know what you're doing." Before Maya could respond, a quiet voice interrupted. "She does," Sundar said softly from 1A. The suited man turned sharply. "What?" Sundar looked at him steadily, not angry, not defensive. Just clear. "She's done everything right," he said. "So has the crew. You were scared. We all were. But that doesn't give you the right to disrespect them now." The words didn't come out like an attack. They came out like a simple truth placed gently between them. The suited man's face stiffened. For a moment it seemed like he would argue. But something in Sundar's eyes, quiet, unwavering, made him falter. Slowly he sank back into his seat without another word. The cabin exhaled collectively. Maya stood there for a second, stunned by the simplicity of it. No raised voice. No dramatic confrontation. Just a few calm words that carried more weight than any order could. She nodded subtly toward Sundar. He gave a small nod back as if to say, "This isn't about me. It's about keeping everyone grounded." The plane finally reached the special gate, where medical personnel and airline staff waited to assist. As the doors opened, cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet pavement and faint jet fuel. Passengers began to disembark slowly, some pausing to thank the crew, others hurrying out with tired relief. Maya stood by the door, offering quiet goodbyes. When Sundar approached the door, he paused briefly and looked at her. "You handled everything with grace," he said quietly. "Not everyone sees that, but I do." His words caught her off guard. She had been holding herself together for hours, focusing on others, managing crises. No one had spoken to her like that all night. She felt something inside her chest loosen, something she hadn't noticed tightening. "Thank you," she said softly, almost like a whisper. He smiled faintly, then stepped out into the night. But as the last passengers left, the ground staff rushed up the jet bridge with urgent expressions. One of them whispered something to Maya quickly. Her eyes widened. Apparently, there had been a sudden security alert inside the terminal. An unaccompanied bag had been found near the arrival corridor connected to their gate. As a precaution, the terminal section was being partially locked down. Arriving passengers, including everyone from her flight, were being held temporarily in the holding zone just past the gate until security cleared the area. Her exhaustion melted into alertness. Just when she thought the night was ending, something else had emerged, this time outside the plane. The captain called her from the cockpit to coordinate with ground security. She glanced through the open door and saw passengers gathering inside the terminal area, restless but contained. Among them, Sundar stood quietly near the back, observing the commotion without stepping forward. The suited man's voice rose again faintly in the distance, complaining about delays. Security officers moved briskly. The young woman from 1B sat against a wall, holding her hands together like someone who had run out of emotions. Maya stepped forward, taking a breath, ready to shift from flight mode to ground coordination. She didn't know it yet, but what was about to unfold in the terminal would bring every emotion of the night. Fear, judgment, humility, resilience, to a single point. And once again, Sundar's presence would change the way people remembered this night. The quiet corridor, the terminal lights were softer than the harsh glow of the runway, but they carried their own kind of weight. Passengers from the flight stood in a holding area just beyond the gate, surrounded by temporary barriers and security personnel. The air smelled faintly of coffee from a nearby kiosk, now closed, and wet pavement drifting in from the tarmac doors. Tired faces stared toward the blocked corridor ahead, where security officers moved with controlled urgency. An unattended bag sat near a row of chairs cordoned off by yellow tape. No one approached it. No one spoke too loudly. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long night, when people are too exhausted to panic but too alert to relax. Maya stood near the gate, her uniform slightly creased, her hair pulled back tightly but her eyes sharp. She was tired to the bone, but the work wasn't done. Security had told her it was likely nothing, a forgotten piece of luggage left behind by another passenger. But protocol required a full inspection. Until then, no one could leave this section of the terminal. She scanned the crowd. Some passengers sat on the floor with their backs against the wall. Some leaned against poles, scrolling through their dead phones out of habit. Some just stared at nothing, waiting for someone else to move first.